Hi, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the legacy, particularly the post-World War II legacy, but generally of Winston Churchill. Now, there's been some have sort of done a reappraisal, if you like, of Churchill's role in the demise and decline of Britain and the Empire, and have suggested that he was actually a key player in this demise, and he should be viewed as a disaster, a wrecking ball of a Prime Minister, and should be seen that way today. And this is, of course, retrospective, going back over 70 years, 80 years. So let's just have a closer look at Churchill and the times and the circumstances he had to work in. The forces that may have shaped his views, and how he responded to the challenges that Britain faced, not only following World War One, or during and following World War One, but also into the Depression, the Great Depression of the 1930s, and indeed into World War II. Now, there are some online commentators, Academic Agent as one. He I think recently did a video about Churchill, I think the heading of his dissertation was "The Worst Prime Ministers" or something like that, where he indicated, Academic Agent says, that Tony Blair may have been bad, but there are also other bad prime ministers which have contributed to Britain's less than optimal status today. So let's go over Churchill anyway. Was he a big player? Was Britain in decline anyway? And whoever was sitting in the chair, the Prime Minister's chair, would they have had to preside over this decline? Was it irrevocable, given the other forces that were at play, forces that Churchill had no real control over? So let's have a look at that. And when Churchill was born, Britain and the Empire was the premier power in the globe. So Britain was the then world's foremost superpower, if you like. And there'd been almost 100 years of major war peace. So the last major war had been the Napoleonic Wars, which were sort of almost a world war, really. And there hadn't been a war on that scale. There had been wars, but there hadn't been a war on that scale since 1815, when Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. And so it had been, roughly 100 years of what was called the Pax Britannica, the Peace of Britain. And this was administered by the vast British trading network, the British Navy, and Britain's economic might. For example, the London Stock Exchange. If you wanted to raise capital for a major, say, public works undertaking or something like that, you would go to the London Stock Exchange. The New York Stock Exchange became prominent later, but at the time, if you wanted to raise capital, you went to London. So now Britain was already in decline, really from probably notably the mid-1870s, and it was an economic and industrial decline, but it wasn't necessarily obvious. World trade was because of the Pax Britannica, and the world trade was increasing. So the water level was rising for everybody, and Britain along with it. Now, Britain also did very well. The British economy did very well out of, say, insurances, finances, things like raising money in the stock exchange, various fees for handling finance, banking. Again, the shipping, something like 50% of all the cargo ships in the world were British. So there was huge revenues coming, but these were invisibles. These were services. They weren't products or manufactured products or advanced technology. They were services. And by virtue of Britain's role in, say, finance, they were able to get a lot of insurance work, and because of the insurance work, a lot of shipping, and so on and so. So it was very much so their trade in what was referred to as invisibles, that is, services, not goods. Trade in invisibles was huge, and this masked the decline in British industry. Now, there were two attacks, I'll use the word attack generically, but two attacks on British industry. One was Britain, Germany and the United States were both pursuing a very aggressive nationalistic policy in terms of manufacturing, using the use and deployment of advanced technologies of the day, that as the century wore on, 1890s, electronics became, huge, optics, chemicals, mass production, interchangeable parts, all these sorts of things. And Germany and the United States were at the forefront of these things. In addition, Germany and the United States both used tariffs to protect local industries, but they did something that many other countries don't do. They were giving the local industry tariff protection, but only if they could make top quality products, affordable products that could be exported. You couldn't use it for, I mean, some did, I suppose, but you couldn't use the tariffs to hide behind just to be lazy and engage in all sort of padding and feather bedding and useless, piss poor products that are overpriced. You couldn't do that. You had to do products that could be exported. And so the quality of the American manufactured product, German too, particularly in precision engineering and things like that, American and German products began to pull well ahead technologically of the British. Something I've mentioned before, a salesman, I think it was from Colt, in the 1890s came to Britain, and he had 6 revolvers, and he broke them all up into parts, jumbled them up in a like a container, and then just reassembled, from rando parts, reassembled the 6 guns, 6 pistols, which worked perfectly. And the British were hugely impressed by this, because at that stage, much, not all, but much of British industry was cottage-based, so that there could be the same product, theoretically the same spec, but the factory, 100 miles up the road would make, it's a slightly different size than, their gauges and measuring instruments weren't quite the same. And so the factory 100 miles down south would make the same product, but it was just a few microns out. Different measuring. So they couldn't, so the British were way behind in things like standardized parts, and also in areas like advanced electrics, chemicals, metallurgy, and things like that. The British were falling quite a bit behind. There was a little bubble of exception in, say, the technology used in building ships, but even that was falling behind. The fleet that the Germans were building, for example, in World War One, they were generally ship for ship much better technology than the much better quality guns and cannon, all that sort of stuff. So the British were already falling behind in naval terms as well. Now, when World War One arrived, so 1914, Britain had already slipped to being a third in this. So they'd gone from number 1 in, say, 1898. Again, a lot of this was sheer economic mass. A lot of this was the invisibles, again, as I referred to earlier, things like insurance and finance, shipping, and all that sort of stuff. They'd already fallen behind quite considerably in industrial technology and in technological lead and, mass production, economies of scale, standardized parts, all this sort of stuff. Britain had already fallen well behind by the 1890s. And by the time 1914 came around, Britain had slipped to a very clear third place. In industrial terms, they were probably jostling for a 4th place with France. So this just goes to show how far Britain had fallen when World War One came along. Now, in World War One, the economy, particularly when you measure industrial strength, and also particularly if you add in the calculus for efficiency of their industry, the German industry or German productive mass, if I can use that in industrial terms, was already greater than France and Britain combined. So just to give you German industrial production was already greater than France and Britain combined come 1914. This seemed to have escaped people. Now, when the war began, a lot of the trade in invisibles that Britain had enjoyed disappeared. So then Britain just fell back on their industrial economy, which was nowhere near the potency or the magnitude that it once had been. So Britain was losing. The cost of World War One wasn't simply the cost of the war, which was huge, but it was also that Britain's economy shrank quite considerably given the amount of invisibles trade that they had lost, which you do lose in war. So Britain was already on the sharp decline. And this seems to be forgotten, that Britain was like a big heavy hitter player, but they'd already slipped, they were behind the United States and Germany by quite a measure, if you look at just industrial capacity and the efficiency of that. These little cottage industry factories all around the place. Britain still had a considerable output, but it was so spread out and so sort of a micro cottage industry type level that they couldn't match the big factories and the economies of scale, the mass production of Germany and the United States. So World War I comes along. Now, Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty. Remember, he's a member of the aristocracy. He's sort of got a lot of good connections. He's buddies with the Prime Minister in 1915, David Lloyd George. So Churchill gets the gig as First Lord of the Admiralty. Now, Churchill's quite a gung-ho guy. He's been, at the Boer War in South Africa, where he was captured and he escaped and was considered to be a heroic adventure there. He was part of the expedition that went to kick ass in the Sudan for the murder of General Gordon, a decade or so earlier. So he was, in that Kitchener's thing there. His mother was very well connected. His father had been a parliamentarian. So his mother could write and pester people and say, no, I want my son to be a member of this or that military expedition. Churchill had been a journalist of some note, and he was quite a wordsmith, by the way. And then World War I comes along. He's First Lord of the Admiralty. Now Churchill was a creature of empire. Remember, he was strutting the stage when Britain was the number one world power, and his perception of empire and Britain's place in the world, the importance of empire to British prestige, all these sorts of things, figured very much in his psychological makeup, given when he was born and when he was in his youth and when he was a young man, like what would he have been, when he was in his 20s and so on. Again, Britain was still considered to be the number one power. The British showed off their fleet at Spithead Port in 1897, I think it was, and the whole world came to look, and they were oohing and ahhing and in awe of what the British had in terms of naval muscle. And but instead of being overawed by it, especially the Germans and the Americans, they went away thinking, hey, we got to catch up to this. And Germany and America did have the industrial capacity and the technical knowledge to catch up. Not like some of the others that didn't have a snowball's chance. Those two did, and they created very formidable fleets. If you see Theodore Roosevelt, the American president, sending the fleet around the world to impress on everybody that America was a player on the world stage in that regard. So Churchill was a sort of this grand. Now he saw in terms of the 7 Years' War, 1756 to the Napoleonic War, and he saw Britain's military capacity as being in delivering grand strategic masterstrokes. Their navy, a large navy, could appear somewhere and deliver a crushing blow to the enemy, and because they had the capacity through the navy to and across the oceans to project power anywhere on the globe. And this was a sort of view, like a generic view that Churchill had. There was another thing that Britain had always been involved in, that there had to be an equal or even balance of power on the continent, in the European continent. And should that balance of power swing too heavily one way or another, then Britain would be disadvantaged. And so British sort of, the wider geopolitical policy was to try and maintain that balance of power. When Germany became powerful, the British divined that the balance of power has been upset. We have to intercede to rebalance the balance of power. And but Churchill in World War I again was always looking for this grand strategic masterstroke. Instead of just getting on and prosecuting the war efficiently with better quality weapons, better quality production, better products, better military training and organization. Instead of doing that, Churchill's running around looking for strategic masterstrokes. Now, some of this because the German Navy was too formidable for the British to sort of go in directly and strike the German Navy in their port or something like that. The really quite minor engagements. They were kind of a draw. Maybe even you could say the Germans came out a little bit better. But in the end, the British Navy was largely impotent given the nature of that war, and particularly with the issue of aircraft, that were fairly new on the scene. Submarines were fairly new on the scene, and this changed the dynamic of how, say, heavy battleships could be deployed. You can send out a heavy battleship, but then it could be sunk by a submarine. So then you had to have smaller patrol boats to protect the battleship and to constantly be buzzing around watching for submarines. And so then later on in the war, you needed air cover because planes could come in and sink the battleship. So the whole structure of surface fleet warfare really had changed, and so the British Navy couldn't deliver the knockout blows, decisive hits that they once could. So Churchill was really pushed into, well, what else can we do? And the strategic masterstrokes thing, very much in Churchill's makeup, by the way, was something that he pursued, and that was where the disaster of Gallipoli came. Now, Gallipoli was as a basic idea, I think it was sound enough. But the first naval attempts at breaking the Dardanelles Strait into the Black Sea, they'd been unsuccessful, and I thought rather mismanaged, really. But they were unsuccessful, and then the decision was made to make a military landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula when the opportunity for surprise and so on it's largely been lost. So I don't know what a good idea it really was at that stage. Nonetheless, Churchill was the sponsor of it, and the idea was to knock Turkey, who was a German ally, out of the war. If they'd successfully pulled off the Gallipoli thing, it probably would have. But the reality was the surprise factor was fairly limited. The landing places where they were supposed to land were all stuffed up, and mistakes were made, and access points that were for the troops to quickly scale the heights. They were landed in the wrong place and couldn't get around. But the Turkish army lost more than double the amount of men that the Allies lost in that struggle. So the cost to Turkey was huge in men, material, and so on. And they never really recovered from it. So it was really it certainly wasn't a victory for the British and their allies, but it was still a severe blow to the Turks in terms of the amount of men they lost, hundreds of thousands, and the amount of material and the struggle and the fallout from that struggle. And the Turks again never really recovered from that, in my view. So it wasn't a total non-success, but did it achieve its objectives? No. Did the failure as it was come at a high cost? Absolutely. So Churchill bore much of the responsibility for that, even though the bottom line tactical planning of which beach, which troops landed on, and this sort of stuff, that had nothing to do with Churchill. So it was a little unfair that he got saddled with the whole thing. But nonetheless, should he have gone ahead with that Gallipoli thing, given the element of surprise was lost, and given what a high risk venture it was, trying to land vast numbers of troops at that time, like it was still dark, and where it's very easy to miss the correct landing spot. And had all the troops landed on the correct landing, the precise landing spot, I think they would have won. They probably would have won, quite a crushing and spectacular victory. But it wasn't to be. And again, I think it's a little unfair for Churchill. Now, Churchill was in the wilderness for quite some time, and is seen as a bit of an outlier and a troublemaker, and someone that jumped on this or that hobby horse, and so he wasn't thought of. Now, as Germany began to rearm in the mid-1930s, Churchill began to warn of the possibilities that if Germany did rearm, and given their population and given their industrial capacity, if Germany had rearmed, they would be a formidable adversary. And the Germans had never really forgiven the British and the French for the Versailles Treaty. And so Churchill quite reasonably and quite rightly pointed out that this was a bit of a toxic sort of mix coming up here. Should something be done about it? And he suggested that the British defence budget should be increased, particularly in the area of aircraft, and which Churchill and many, not just Churchill, many perceived aircraft would be an absolutely pivotal part of warfare in the future, which it was. Now, Churchill was still in the wilderness until he was recalled to the Admiralty by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain when things were looking pretty grim, and in relation to Germany and the hostilities. So Churchill was firstly put in the Admiralty, and then after the crushing defeat of the British and the French in 1940 in France, Churchill was made Prime Minister. Now, what's happened between World War I and World War II economically for Britain? Britain has fallen behind even further technologically and industrially. So trading within the empire and the Commonwealth, again, invisibles, trade, shipping, insurance, and the like. These sort of things. These are still a big part of the British economy. So Britain has actually fallen further behind. It's now well behind sort of the German capacity and the American capacity. So it's fallen behind the Soviet Union. So Britain's now jostling again for 4th or 5th place in the world ranking, and has nowhere near the industrial capacity necessary to prosecute a major war. This is something a lot of people are forgetting. Britain's no longer a player at the big table at this point. And Churchill insisted that Britain was a player at the big table and could be a player at the big table. And Churchill, a man of empire that was gone, still thought of Britain in terms of having the clout and the ability and the muscle to play at the big table, but he couldn't. Now, if ever there was something you could level at Churchill, that would be it. That he had the view Britain was still a heavy hitter when it wasn't, and prosecuted a war, picking a fight with Hitler and that sort of thing, that Britain on its own couldn't possibly win. I mean, not even close. So why engage in a war? Now, in addition to that, from a military point of view, Britain's army had military capacity had fallen to third rate as well. So the Japanese armed forces completely outclassed the British. The German armed forces again completely outclassed the British. The British were better than the Italian armed forces, but the Italian armed forces were a 4th, 5th tier military machine anyway. So the British really were just not playing at the big table at all, militarily, industrially, or financially. So why would Churchill? Now, Churchill pointed out when the British had been defeated and things were looking pretty grim for the British, that Hitler's terms for the British surrender would be a huge blow to Britain's prestige worldwide. All the peoples that the British were administering in Africa and Asia and elsewhere would effectively see the British as just a bunch of punks to be slapped around, because given how easily Germany had defeated. So the prestige factor, but also Churchill sort of believed if they stayed in the war long enough, just hung in there, that eventually the United States would enter the war. And this was the big gamble that Churchill made, that the Americans would enter the war and that their industrial capacity and their population and size of their military would swing the balance in Britain's favour. Now, was that a wise move by Churchill? Britain couldn't afford a war. It couldn't win the war. So there was really nothing but downside. And if America came in the war to effectively prevent Britain from falling under the dominion of the German government, then the Americans would want something for that. And a lot of the British bases, British shipping routes, a whole lot of things, the British handed over a lot of stuff to the Americans, and the Americans also pressed after the war that a lot of the closed markets of the British Empire and Commonwealth must be open to American goods. So the British lost handsomely in that go around of trade and so on there, which was their only way to make up for the losses they were incurring during the war. So Churchill's made a couple of misjudgments here. Now, would someone else have done it different? Well, quite possibly. I mean, Lord Halifax was considered to be the primary choice before Churchill as Prime Minister, and Halifax and others wanted to cut some deal with Hitler. Hitler was desperate to be considered as an equal to the British, who he very much admired, and so he would have been flattered in the extreme to have been treated as the respect of a great leader by the British. And Hitler's terms were, look, the empire's yours, do what you want, just don't pester us, leave us in control of the continent or the primary power in the continent, and you guys can pretty much do what you like. And would that have meant a reduction in British goods sold in the continent? Oh, yeah, there's no question. German manufacturers would have taken up those markets, but those were lost to Britain anyway. The idea that Britain could hang on to that, given its declining industrial position and technological position, Britain had lost that anyway. So Churchill was trying to fight about a war when the reasons to fight the war really were quite limited. I don't think that he should have done that. Was it from a prestige and so on point of view sort of worthwhile? Well, maybe. But from a real practical point of view, it was a disastrous decision. The choice was to fight or not to fight, and Hitler's terms were quite generous, and Britain would have come out of it far, far better than they did by fighting the war, in my view. So did Churchill contribute to the downfall of Britain? Yeah. But was Britain on a downfall path anyway, though? And this is the big question. Whether Churchill accelerated by a few years or whatever is beside the point. Because of the Cold War that came later on, Britain was then artificially buttressed by the Western Bloc, led by the United States, which compensated for some of the decline. So there's a bit of nuance to this that needs to be considered. Was Churchill a successful wartime leader? I would argue no. I mean, he was inspirational, going around with the V sign and making stirring speeches and all that sort of stuff. But the reality was quite different. Britain couldn't win a trick in that war. I mean, other than beating the Italians a couple of times. Britain's military achievements were close to zero in that war, and the cost of prosecuting the war bankrupted Britain. So nothing was really accomplished in my view. Had the British made a peace with Hitler, which in hindsight would have been the sensible thing to do, then the Germans would have, I think, easily defeated the Soviets. And would have wiped communism off the map, certainly in Russia and the Soviet Union, and so performed to the world a great service. And what would have happened after that? Well, if you had to believe in some of Hitler's musings, once all that had been done, then he would retire to his mountain retreat in Bavaria and live the life of a country gentleman, which he did show, by the way, many signs of aspiring to. So that would have been So what was Churchill responsible for? Was he the big kingpin of Britain's demise? Well, no. Britain was declining fast anyway. Britain's role in world affairs was already as a bit player, and the prosecuting the war against Hitler was from an economic and what's in it for Britain point of view. It achieved absolutely nothing. It was a negative outcome for Britain, victory or not. But that Britain was on a downhill trajectory anyway, and strangely, the war, World War II, didn't really change that. You'd think there would have been many technological breakthroughs as there was in Germany and the United States, but in Britain, on a relative basis, there were very few. they didn't come out with world-class, top-of-the-range mass production factories with kick-ass manufacturing plants and equipment in there. Instead, Britain was, everything of the plant was old and tired by the time the war ended in many instances. So the launching pad for Britain to be, have a real impact on the world industry and industrial sector was already fast diminishing, and it wasn't improving. And as German industry and French industry and so on rebuilt, the markets that Britain did have were only temporary and were lost to better quality products at a better price. And British products were, by the 70s, were considered to be inferior quality and just not well enough priced, not well made, and so on and so forth, technologically behind. So these are things that would have happened regardless whether Churchill had been around or not. So had he made mistakes during the war? Was it a mistake to fight Germany? So, well, maybe, and that's something to be debated. But this idea, was Churchill responsible? I don't agree. Britain was already on a downhill trajectory, and the war just accelerated, and Churchill just happened to be the man in the seat at the time. But no matter who was sitting there, the demise, the decline would have been more or less the same. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback Channel. Thank you for listening.